Doris, your darling bus, episode number 2.
G'day folks, and welcome to Doris, your darling bus, a fortnightly podcast about the unsung hero of the music industry, the tour bus. Today's guest is the lead guitarist of the Screaming Jets and a very well-known and respected blues musician. He's recorded a swag of solo albums with various backing bands, as well as recording and touring with the Jets, the Astro Boys, the Astros, the Housewarmers, Spectre 7 and the Angels. The winner of the 2005 Solo International Blues Challenge in Memphis, Tennessee, the one and only Jimi the Human Hocking. Thank you very much for taking the time today to chat.
No worries at all. Nice to be here. And well, I must say, when you put it all together like that, I sound fantastic. I should put that on a T-shirt. It makes me sound like a very well-rounded artiste.
Well, you are. You've had a long and varied career, which is why I wanted to have you on the show, because you've done all sorts of different touring.
Yeah. I've ticked a lot of boxes, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So I want to start with a song that you wrote called My First Car.
Yes.
So you sing about the Italian Mercedes, which is a phrase I've never heard before. Tell me about your first car.
Well, my first car was a beautiful VE squareback Valiant. And in those days, so I'm talking about the 80s now, where some people listening or interviewing may not have been born, but I was a child of the 60s and then into the 70s and 80s when I got my license and my first car. And in those days, old like HQ Holdens and VE Valiants, AP6s and 5s, and even XM Fords and XP Fords were not expensive cars yet. They were not deemed as cool, like they. I mean, it's hard to get your head around now because they're kind of perceived as these great vintage cars. But my first car was a VE Valiant in great condition, and I think that's a late 60s model, maybe a 68 or 69. I have not standing corrected on that one, but it was $900. But it blew out because the mechanic who fixed it up for me, who was a fellow musician, a drummer in the band, he had to install a new radio or something the last minute before the sale went through, and it cost $1,200. So I think that car now would cost more like $25,000.
Yeah, right.
And the thing about a Valiant like that, they could fit a Marshall quad box, 4x12 box, and a head side by side in the boot with a Les Paul case, also side by side in the boot of that car. You could shut the boot and you wouldn't even know they were in there.
Yeah.
Which made it, for me, that was my whole rig, that was my whole life.
Yeah, for sure.
The perfect touring car.
Yeah, cool, because that leads me to my next question. Obviously, you said that you've had a string of Valiants, and over the years you would have had a gazillion cars, I'm sure.
Yeah.
How much does being a working musician factor into your decision-making when buying a car?
Well,
because you're obviously a car guy.
Well, you'd be surprised. I love the style. I know nothing about mechanics. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know bits and pieces. I can point to what things are in the car. But I'm not a tinkerer. I don't mess around with the car. But I love those old cars. I had a couple of Valiants along the way, even a Safari wagon, which didn't last very long because it was a bit of a mess when I got it. But the car after that VE sort of died, I suppose, was the roundback AP6. So it was a beautiful car, torque flight, the boomerang tow bar. My dream car was an S-Series Valiant, which has the push-button auto. That was always my dream car. But I never ended up with one of those. But I had this AP6 for many years after the VE. And the reason I picked that car also was because I knew how the car sat on the road. They were great highway cars. I had an XM Ford too at one point for a short time. And that was a great punchy car, sort of like Mustang motor, short stroking engine. But what it was really spongy on the road. So when you filled it up with gear and went out on the highway, it was always a little bit kind of like marshmallow under the wheels. Even though I liked those cars, whereas the Valiant was like a Lego brick.
Yeah, sure.
It was blocky. I had Whiteys on the Valiant, which were not stock. And the thing was, that car would sit on the road so evenly and so safely with all that gear in it. And I just got so used to driving it. You know, they had bench seats. I could like lounge across the seat while I was like driving in the highway. And I had all that gear in the boot. Well, all that gear, guitar and an amp. Yeah. And I could park it at a service station going for a sandwich and you wouldn't know it was full of musical gear.
Yeah, awesome.
Which was a real plus. Even if we had a station wagon, you couldn't do that. So that was really a big thing for me.
Yeah, it's interesting because you don't, like, that's non-existent these days. Like, when I go and look at a car, you just can't get anything
There's no boots.
that big or with a big boot. And when I got my current car, it's the same size as my last car because I thought, oh, well, I know how much I can fit into my car.
Yeah.
And then I got this new one, it's the same size. I go, yep, sweet. It's the same dimensions, it's maybe about 5 centimetres longer, but inside it is so much smaller.
I don't get I know they're making them kind of safer and more comfortable, but even now when we hire vehicles with the Screaming Jets, everyone used to drive Taragos.
Yep.
20 years ago, everyone had Tarago, and the thing was that model Tarago, whatever the hell it was, drove kind of like a car. So it was a people mover. It felt like a car because you weren't too far up the front, like a Combi or something like that, And yet it still had ample space behind the rear seats to put quite a lot of bags and some gear even. The new versions of the Taragos, we don't get them. They've all got Kias now and those kind of things. And you can literally put the people in there, but you can't put your bag. Hardly any bags fit in the back. Yeah. In fact, the section for the bags barely fits everybody's. We've downsized our bags, let's put it that way, to make it fit into those cars, which seems ridiculous in such a large vehicle, And those Valiants, I think of them as big cars because they seem to be back in the day, but now I see them parked occasionally next to modern cars, and they're not actually that big.
They're just not as thick, I guess.
Yeah, they're actually a little bit smaller, to be honest, than what? Just a modern sedan, I suppose. Yeah. So there was something about a bit deceiving how they were. I guess a lot of people's first car was little Cortinas and Mazdas and stuff like that in my period, so they were small cars, The Honda Civic came out when I was a young man. That was it was a bit bigger than a Morris Minor, really. Yeah.
Let's talk about your early days in the music industry. So you grew up around music, and you learned guitar at a young age.
Yeah.
From a young age, I should say, and you started playing around Melbourne in the early 80s?
Yep. Well, really, my first pub gigs were in the early 80s. I think about 81. I started playing like local hotels. I might not have been, I was just old enough. And but my dad's a great musician. My mum was a singer, so it was kind of the family business. And so, unlike many of my contemporaries, and I don't know about your good self, but there was no resistance from me. When I said I want to go play in a band or whatever, it was like, yep, that's fine. Yeah, cool. You had to do it properly. It wasn't like you couldn't just be out there being an idiot. You actually had to learn your craft and practice, and that was kind of part of the yes. Yeah. But nonetheless, the answer was yes. It was doable.
From that early age, was touring something that you had thought about, or was it kind of a starry-eyed, like that's what I really want to do, or was it just I want to play music for a living and that's what I have to do as part of it?
I don't think I knew how it worked. I don't think I understood the idea of touring, and I certainly didn't do any major tours for the first X amount of years of my playing career, because in those days it was a different equation. You couldn't just get a gig in Sydney at a hotel unless you had an agent or unless you worked with the agency. There was some gigs that you could do locally because you could kind of walk in and with your demo tape and the guy might give you a show. But interstate, you just had no information. Like we live in an age where the internet and the phone book and everything are so full of information, whereas in the early 80s it just wasn't the case. So everything was either word of mouth or people got managers at a really early time in their career because they just didn't know what to do next. So the first tour that I ever did was essentially in the Astro Boys, or the Astros, so 85 say, when we piled all our gear into the back of the drummer's Valiant, which is a station wagon, and drove to Sydney to do like 2 gigs. And that was considered a tour in those days. I mean, we were literally, one of us was lying on the top of the speaker boxes in the back, and it's ridiculous. And years later, people started doing things like, I remember Josie bought a van, and we would sometimes hire that off her, and people got this idea of hiring vans and driving around, but they still weren't decked out. And I've got to say, one of the first people, even a few years later, maybe this is now the end of the 80s I might be looking at, Jeff Lang was one of the first people I ever saw do touring like owning a little tour bus, and like in America, like you would do it. Like you would sleep, he was decked out to sleep, and had little curtains and like some living facilities. You could put your gear under here. And I just never thought that it was doable like that. It sounds naive, but it just wasn't an example that anyone had ever offered.
playing music for years before I realised that was a thing, and that
Yeah.
for me was Matt Corcoran.
Yeah, right.
In that truck that he
He
used
did
to
exactly
drive
the same
around.
way, yeah, I remember. Yeah.
And it was just like a bed and a kettle and a camping stove in the back of this truck, and I remember seeing that and going,
Yeah.
so this is how you do it. And
I mean, I've seen Claude Hay had a really amazing van, and like people now take great pride in putting together a great vehicle, and with mirror balls and all like really cool stuff. Whereas in my early tours, everything we drove was completely utilitarian. I mean, it was kind of terrible. And then we started making enough money that we would hire vans. You'd have a deal with Thrifty or somebody, and you would hire these. I don't even know what they were, and I can't remember, like sort of high ace vans. Yeah. And they were completely like a bus that had no comfort built into it whatsoever. It looked like the kind of thing they would drop paratroopers into the hot zones in. And we would have to live in amongst the gear once again. So we would develop systems of like we would hire these vans, so early 90s perhaps now, and we would go and pick them up, take them around the corner with a big shifter and remove one of the seats from the back of the van and leave it at someone's house. Then we would put our quad boxes, and everything was a quad box in those days. So we'd put all our amps and stuff in the back, do the tour, then go back to that house, put the seat back in, bolt it back together, then return the vehicle. So that
pretend like nothing happened.
Yeah, that was how it was always done.
Yeah.
It was a system that we had down to a fine art.
Yeah. And were you doing regional tours with this sort of thing, or was
By
it
then
like
we
what
were,
you were saying?
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I think by then we were starting to do national tours. My first tour was in the Astro Boys. When I say first tour, I mean like with a band that was like touring around. We were following them. We opened for Aussie Crawl. I guess that might have been about 83 when I think about it. So even though that first tour of Sydney was one I attribute to being the first tour, that was off our own volition, We did this kind of regional Victoria, maybe New South Wales tour with Australian Crawl, but I think we had the gear in a truck. I think the deal was we were allowed to put our gear in their truck, and we could just drive whatever that was we drove at the time, I can't remember. So that was like my introduction to touring, but then, for years all it meant was that we all had to lug gear, we all had to know how to do Tetris to get stuff into the car or the van. And that was just how it was.
Just you guys? Did you have roadies as well?
No, roadies. That was like for the rich bands.
Yeah, for sure.
There was no such thing as a roadie. Even now, I go and do solo gigs, and they're restaurant and club gigs and stuff like that in between Jets tours and blues gigs, whatever else. And people say to me, "Oh, where's your roadie?" I'm like, by the time I bring a roadie on board and pay him or her, and this makes this whole thing not really worth my while.
For sure. Yeah.
So it's a strange but an unromantic idea, this touring thing,
And we'll be right back to our chat with Jimi Hocking in a moment. But in the meantime, if you're looking to find Jimmy on the internet, you can search Jimi Hocking at Facebook or on Instagram. Or, of course, you can head to his website, which is jimihocking.com. And if you're looking to get some tunes, you can find Jimmy on Spotify, iTunes, and in any good record store. And if you're an Aussie and you don't know where to find a Screaming Jets record, then I'm sorry, I can't help you. All right, let's get back to it.
In May 1988, it was, the Angels guitarist Bob Spencer broke his hand. Which, unfortunate for him, was quite fortuitous for you.
Indeed it was.
In that you had done some session work with the Angels previously.
No, it's a kind of a very strange story, which has not often been told, the precursor to the Angels tour.
Okay.
Because sometime, I'd be guessing, let's say 85 when he might have joined the band. I'd need to look this up. But at that time, Angels management, which is called Dirty Pool Management, did like a cattle call where they must have rung some studios or rung some agencies and said, we need a guitar player, we're looking for guitar players, is there anybody out there? So I actually got a phone call in the mid-80s saying to me, it was Dirty Pool, we want to see some people about this gig doing the Angels, we've got your number, would you want to come up and audition? But you had to fly yourself to Sydney or get yourself to Sydney, and it was all out of your own pocket to audition. And even though I was a young up-and-comer, and that looked like a big break for somebody, because I grew up in music with my dad and everything like that, watching all great bands and him being involved heavily in music, I knew that they weren't going to get some kid in the band from Melbourne that they didn't know. It didn't make any sense to me. I thought they'll get someone they know, from a rock band like them, like sure. That's how I knew the industry to be. So I didn't go to this audition. It turns out in the scheme of things, 10 or 12 people were asked to go up, and everybody went except a kid named Jimi Hocking.
Yeah.
He was the only no-show for the audition. So cut forward to 88 when this accident happens. Brent Eccles, who was then the drummer of the Angels, also sort of acting as a tour manager like on the side, he was ringing, they were in Melbourne, and he was ringing studios, and he rang Platinum Studios, and Paul Koski, who was a great engineer, still is, he said, oh yeah, we had Jimi Hocking in here doing some sessions this week, he could do it. So Brent Eccles thought, I know that name.
Yeah.
Why do I know this name? So that's why he rang me, because he's thinking, I knew your name, but I didn't know why.
You stood out because you'd kind of ignored the call.
Yeah. So in a weird way, it was a backhanded way that I came through the door. But of course, I had to be able to play. It wasn't just on a plate. And so I remember I went to the hotel that very day when they got the call. It was a very depressed scene because they put a lot of money into this tour. It was
and they were sort of in the middle of the tour by
then,
then,
they were 2 gigs in to
Right, okay.
I think it was like a 2-month tour.
Yeah.
So they had it all in front of them, and it was all about to fall over.
Yeah.
And it was one of the biggest tours they'd undertaken.
Yeah.
You know, even to date probably, because it was in the period when everybody was doing 3 sets. Bob Springsteen was doing these long shows, and everybody decided that would be a thing. So they were doing like 3 Angel sets with a set, you know, like scenery, and Stonehenge would come down. You know, So I turned up at the hotel, and I with my guitar, and I remember the band standing around, very morose because they didn't know what was going to happen. They had a gig the next day at the Palais Theatre in Melbourne, and Rick or somebody said to me, well, okay, let's see what you can play. Play the riff from Long Line. I just sort of play the riff from No Secrets. So I kind of played through a couple of riffs that I just kind of knew because they were, part of the...
They were the Angels,
They were the Angels, of course, And they kind of looked at each other and said, oh, well, maybe, this kid could do it,
Yeah.
And that was kind of how history was made in my world, because, I sat there, they ordered me a meal and rolled some live tapes, and I took some notes and wrote down the set list in my notebook and sort of sat up all night sort of fumbling through songs. And the next day I was at soundcheck at, like 2 o'clock in the afternoon for the gig that night,
Yeah.
So we got away with it. There was a couple of disasters in the set,
Right.
maybe one in particular. But I knew the old stuff in my head, and I'd heard the new stuff because it was on the radio. It was the howling stuff. So, it worked out kind of okay. And then Rick and the guys looked at me at the end of it and said, well, maybe we don't cancel this tour. If we can do that every night at least, we can do this thing.
Yeah.
So I kind of became the temporary member of the band.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, that's a story that I haven't, because there's abridged versions of that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that it goes back so much further than that as
Yeah,
well.
not many people. I've not really told that part of the story very often, because it's just this little precursor to how it came about.
So I found an interview from a few years ago where you were talking about this, and you said, quote, overnight, I found myself on a major rock tour.
Yeah.
Was it what you thought a major rock tour would be?
Well, it kind of was, because at that time, the Angels were really one of the biggest bands in the country. They were riding a wave of success after the Howling album. We got to get out of this place. It'd been on major rotation. They were an iconic rock band then, let alone now 30 years later. But and this was, as I said, a big tour. They were big shows. They were theatre shows, Thebarton Theatre. We did the Palais Theatre in Melbourne, Thebarton. We did the Perth Entertainment Centre. We sold out 2 nights there. I think they're like 8,000 or 10,000 seaters, if memory serves. So they were big shows. So we were treated like a big band for a tour like that, So it was I had my own hotel room, and we stayed at all these ritzy places. Well, I thought they were ritzy. I'd never stayed anywhere,
Of course, yeah.
I remember taking a photo of the rider, because I'd just never seen that much fruit and cheese and stuff laid on for the band. It was like brought in with cap in hand, like, oh, here you are.
Yeah.
Hope everything's okay. I was like, God, in my
serious?
band, we'd be
Yeah.
lucky to get a sandwich or a pizza, but to share between all of us.
Sure.
So it was completely like a dream,
Yeah.
like for a
And I
kid like
imagine
me.
so much bigger
Yeah,
than like the whole production, because like you said, they were with staging. And,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it was a big show. They had and that was in the days when everything you had was in the semi on the road. Yeah, there was no in the jets now we fly from city to city and we hire a back line. And I bring 1, maybe 2 guitars. Like that's kind of it. But in those days, everything went in the truck and it was like a moving circus.
Mm-hmm.
So it really was an incredible experience. Even when I look back at it now, I kind of remember how awe-inspiring it kind of was for a guy like me. Even though I'd seen the industry from another perspective through my parents, I was in this thing. It wasn't me watching. I was walking on the stage every night. And even though people didn't know who I was, I still walked out to these big audiences and was playing loud. And I actually just bought the first Paul Reed Smith guitar in the country. Mm-hmm. It's so different now, but that tour that I did with the Angels, those tours still existed, because beyond that, I did supports for, I'm on one of the Jimmy Barnes tours, playing for Swanee and with my band as well on the bill. And I toured with the not the Stray Cats, George Thorogood when he came to Australia. Joe Satriani we opened for, did the tour with him, and they were all the same kind of shows. They were kind of theatre shows, and that was, by the time now I was like Jimmy the Human and Spectre 7. Yeah. I'd got a record deal through EMI, so we were at the tail end of those big touring days. That was probably right before the whole thing kind of crashed for a couple of years, because directly after those days when I did the Jimmy the Human thing, which would now bring us to like the early 90s, the Unplugged thing happened. Lots of venues changed, and I think there might have been new laws about drinking and stuff like that, which really kind of had an effect on what gigs you could do and the general musical landscape. But I survived because I'd always played folk clubs, and I'd had a strong acoustic gig before it was even cool to have one. Yeah. So I just ploughed on doing that before moving to Sydney and ending up doing the Screaming Jets gig.
Yeah. Was it easy to transition between those big touring gigs and your smaller kind of folk clubs and doing your acoustic thing?
I have no trouble going between those two places. I know people who don't actually, and they find it difficult. But I'm not sure why. I just kind of take one look at the gig and see what it is, and that's what it is. If it's a big show, you kind of play to the big audience, but you're still on a stage in your own little environment in some ways. And if it's a small show, well, then it's a small show. Sometimes they can be more fun because you have a more intimate response with people. Especially if they like you. It can be really awesome. Because the big shows can be a little bit surreal when you go out to those big crowds. We did Bathurst, I think, a few years ago, and there was like 40 or 50,000 people there. Yeah. And I found with those really big shows, it didn't really feel like you were there. It's just like a sea of noise as opposed to an actual audience.
Actual faces.
Yeah. So they've got their own energy, and it's incredible. But it's sometimes the little shows can be a really nice thing to do.
Okay. You mentioned before touring with Screaming Jets now is jet planes and chauffeured cars.
Well, it's cheap early morning flights and hire vehicles, so if that's what you mean, yeah.
So you've done 2 stints with the Jets, first in the mid to late 90s, and then from 2010 till now.
Yeah.
The stint that you did in the 90s, was touring different then?
Oh, completely and utterly. We lived on the road then. Yeah. There was no coming home. So I guess it was like from 93 till nearly the end of the 90s. And so I did 2 albums. I came in midway through the second album, which was already recorded. I re-recorded some stuff of, I think, some of the singles that came out. But the first album I recorded with the band was the Gorilla album. Right. And the thing was, I only came in as a temporary measure because Richie, the original guitar player, had fallen ill while they were in America. But the short version of the story is he just simply never came back, and it got dragged out and out along. It was like, well, he's not back. Do you want to do the next tour? Yeah. Like, sure. So these tours were bumped back to back. Yeah. And because airfare structures and stuff were completely different in those days, you couldn't just fly in and out because an airfare was $1,000. It wasn't like it is now, where there's cheap flights in the morning and all that kind of stuff. So you stayed out. Like we had a semi, we had a hire vehicle. All our gear, I'd had 5 guitars, I had 2 quad boxes and 2 heads on the road. It was all in that semi. Yeah. And if we were in Queensland, we just had to keep going because you couldn't drive back to Melbourne for the weekend. Yeah. So I remember the first 4 years, I calculated that we'd all been in our homes about maybe less than 10 days of each year. Yeah. So we lived on the road. That was it. I paid rent at a flat for nearly a year in Sydney before I realised I was just throwing money out the window. And I pulled up stumps there, put my stuff in storage, and in between tours, which would be a matter of days, I lived at a hotel in King's Cross. Yeah. So it was a real rock and roll existence, I can tell you. And one of the reasons that the band kind of imploded at a certain point was because we just were a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
We were too much in each other's pockets. Because what happened in Outaraga was the whole world, you know. We weren't living outside that enough because we just lived on the road all year. So that kind of was almost the undoing of me in the band at a certain point. And then the band continued for a couple more years with Izzy Osmanovic, who's a great guitar player. But then, even then, it still felt the wheels kind of fell off, and the band had a break for maybe 3 or 4 years, if I recall. So in that time, Dave and me, we'd always stayed close, and we did a solo album for him. We worked on that. And that was like a little home-baked thing, like my blues albums. We just made in my garage, basically. And but then the band kind of reformed a couple of years later. I was in America. I kind of was still doing my, like maybe I'll do something in America thing. But then the time was kind of right for me to come back. I think I did some gigs in 2009 actually with the band, and then officially kind of came back in 2010.
Okay.
Yeah.
And by then, had it sort of changed, and it was now cheap flights and high vans?
That's basically what it was. It was morphing at that time. We did a couple of little driving tours when I first came back in the band because we had no money. You know, one of the original members had kind of like left the band, and then a big divorce had gone down. It was costly to the band. It nearly sent the whole thing under financially. So in the next few years, with me back and with new management came on board eventually, we just worked our way out of debt.
Yeah.
You know, so we did that. Then we ended up making the Chrome record, which is the last original album we did. We did another album since then. But that was a really cathartic experience for the band because we kind of regrouped, and Steve James, our former producer, came back. He's a genius, and we made this really good record, and we kind of didn't care if anybody liked it or not in the end. It was just like, we've made a great record, you know. That was the outcome, you know. So that really put us back into a positive frame of mind, and that was why we're still here, I suppose.
Yeah, cool. Excellent.
When I first came into the band, I think David had said to me, like, it was a given that I could play. It was kind of like, that was like, well, we assume you can play because Chucky said you can. And then it was like, one of the real things was that I was considered a road warrior, as they said in those days. Because even though I was living in Sydney and I came to do another band that didn't happen, every 2 weeks I was just getting in my car and driving to Melbourne and playing a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night gig there, like solo shows, because I was still in debt to my old record disaster. So I was paying it off by doing these solo shows. I was taking no money for it and just sending it straight via the agency to the record company, and then driving back. And I got so blasé about this drive that I would literally, it didn't matter what time, I wouldn't like get up in the morning and diligently leave before the traffic or after the trucks, you know. I would just literally like have lunch and decide, I might leave now. And if that meant I pulled into Melbourne at 4 a.m. and crashed at my sister's place, then that's what happened, you know. And I was completely oblivious to the idea that it was a 9-hour drive. And I think that by then I had this Ford, what were those Fords with the big square headlights? All the police cars had them too. I can't remember. XE? I can't remember.
I don't know.
But I had that car at that time, and I literally drove that car to death.
Yeah.
You know, and it was a good car, but I murdered it, you know. And all my mechanics said the same thing to me, like, you're just a car killer. Yeah. You know, because how many miles? Like, I'd be literally there for every X amount of 1,000 kilometres, and I'd be like 2 months later, I'd be back and like, what have you been doing? I'm like,
a bulk discount at your mechanic.
That's right. People who don't spend a lot of time on the road can't fathom these kind of drives. I remember in the middle of that, in the early Jimmy the Human days, I went to England, not to play music, just to visit some relatives. And so my cousins took me out to see the local hotshot band and came up to, we had, sit down for a beer and have a chat. This is our cousin from Australia, he's in a band, you know. So these guys started quizzing me about my life, and they didn't have much of a scope on how Australia was anyway. Yeah. And so then they tell me, I remember the guitar player said to me, he said he had an AC30, but it was too loud. And I was touring with 2 quad boxes and heads, you know. I'm like, so he said, what do you use? And I'm like, well, I use a couple of Marshalls. And I could see that even as I was answering these initial questions, he already thought I was bullshitting to him. And he was almost gesturing to his bandmates to say, listen to this guy, you know. And then it got to the point of like where the gigs were, and they were talking about, because England's small to me, and I was saying, we were going to go up north to do this gig, but it was like 5 hours drive, and I'm like, you know what, in Australia,
do that after a gig.
I'll drive 9 hours to another city. I said, and every weekend that I'm not doing that, I do a Friday night. The way we should do it, we do a coastal show either side and a city show. So we do 3 gigs in a week in the Jimmy the Human days, and that means I would drive to Warrnambool on say Thursday or something, and then Friday we might do a city show, and then Saturday, whichever way round it was, we would drive down the South Gippsland Freeway and go down there and play, one of those towns. So Warrnambool, for example, I would get in my car, drive 3.5 hours to the gig, do the gig. I didn't like the accommodation, so I'd just get straight back in the car and drive home again. And they quite literally, I couldn't convince these crew that was a real story. They, to this day, they're probably still laughing at my cousin about the guy that reckoned he did this.
Yeah.
Like, I never said a single exaggeration to them. It was all true, but they couldn't get their head around it.
It's funny how you condition yourself to that, because I would do things like that now, and I look back on it and I go, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I would never, and I guess because I was like 18, 19, I was invincible and
Of course.
and all that sort of stuff. Like, I remember doing a blues train one time, and Queenscliff was all sold out. So I drove in Geelong, and I couldn't find anywhere in Geelong. So I'll stuff it, because I'd been on the road for probably 2 or 3 months by then.
Yeah.
It's the last gig of the tour. I was like, I'll just drive home to Canberra. And
I've done exactly the same thing.
I get home at 9 or 10 in the morning,
Yeah.
and like I look back on it now and I go, that's
I don't know how
That's
I can't
crazy.
do it now.
I couldn't do it.
I mean, I've got kids and everything now who don't sleep very well, so I'm always tired. I live in a world of being tired, so I can't do that stuff.
Yeah.
But back in the day, I can remember one of the earliest Broadbeach festivals, which might have been 17 years ago for all I can remember. That was in the days when you had to take your own PA to the festival and play outside somewhere. And I drove up in some little car that I borrowed from a girlfriend, and with my little vocal PA and acoustic guitar in it. And then when I finished my last gig, I think I'd planned to stay like halfway somewhere, drive X amount of hours and stay there. And then once I got to, like the second location, I still felt quite awake, and it was getting a bit late to check in. And I thought,
just keep going.
I'll just keep going.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And I ended up coming home like, nearly a day early.
Yeah.
Because I just kept driving.
Yeah.
I probably pulled over and had a little power nap and had a cup of coffee somewhere. But in those days, I could do that. I just listen to music and stare out the window and even now I'm a notebook guy. I mean, I've got one right now in my little man bag. I'll think of song lyrics and stuff like that whilst driving along and pull over to write them down or something. So I just did that and
there's no greater sight than your own bed.
That's so
After
true.
a drive that long, it's just like this glorious,
I know, right?
surrounded by celestial light.
My love.
Yeah.
So, but it's a great adventure, and I mean, even though I'm not really up for it now at my age, I'm still pretty hard. I'm a pretty hardened road guy. I can do tours, and it's not a pain in the ass for me. Because we're a collective. The Screaming Jets is a fun group. We enjoy each other's company. We understand each other's idiosyncrasies. We know each other a long time. So, I can go and do these weekends away. And a lot of people look at me and go, I wouldn't do that. I say, well, I will, because it's, we get to play music. We get to do what it is I wanted to do. I always wanted to be a guitar player. Make no mistake. I didn't want to be a front man or anything like that. I wanted to be a guitar player. That was my dream idea, And here I am doing it. I play cool guitars. I play a nice band. I've got good friends. And then I get home and I'm dad all week, unlike a 9-to-5er who's off, working every day. So I actually feel like I'm still in the lucky seat, It doesn't matter. It kind of doesn't matter how shit the gig might be on the weekend. I'm home again Monday, do a couple of solo shows, do a bit of teaching. Yeah. I'm working on a little book that I'm trying to put together, So, I play with the kids, and it's a great life.
Yeah, it sounds joyful.
Yeah, but it's kind of what you make it, because I also know people who I met in America who were some Australians touring around, and I won't say who they were, but they were hating it. They were like, the accommodation's crap, and we're getting sick from eating burgers. Like, well, you got to make the most of this. This could be the only time you do it, and by the sounds of it, it will be, So you really got to adjust your antenna a little bit to make these things, a good experience, maybe.
What have you learned from spending weeks and months in Valiants and Tarragos with other musicians?
Well, that's a $64 million question right there. I reckon, I think one of the things, my take-home messages about touring is to do it, you can't be soft. Like if you have a nice hotel, bonus. Yeah. But if you don't, suck it up. This is it. Like if you're too precious, it's not going to work. You've got to remind yourself why you're there. But also, just to be in the game with groups of people, you've got to have a good sense of sort of fellowship and maybe even a degree in armchair psychology, just to understand that everybody's wired up a little bit differently, and somebody needs their space sometimes, somebody doesn't sometimes. It's all those little subtle nuances of person-to-person relationship that can kind of be the reason you might even stay around. Yeah. Because I know lots of great players who can't get a gig and they don't know why, and some of them are complete dickheads. Yeah. And you think, well, I know why, because fun to be around, or I mean, not that you have to be like the fun guy, but if you're hard work,
you got to work with people.
It's about that, So I think you just take it on as the adventure that it is.
Yeah.
It's kind of a young man's game in some ways, because I don't know that I could do it now. When I started going to America, it kind of became an offer on the table. I could move over there, and and I had gigs offered to me and an agent and everything. But I was in my 40s by then, and I was like, I had no wife or kids or anything, and I just didn't know if I wanted to go back to square one and a half and just start the process all over again. Yeah. Had I been 25, you would never see me. That would have been the end of Jimi Hocking. I'd be over there gone.
Yeah.
But I wasn't. I was like 45 or whatever I was, So it was just something
I guess your priorities kind of changed.
Yeah. It was nice that it was in front of me, but I just didn't feel like spending another 10 years doing it, if you know what I mean. It doesn't sound like I don't want to be ungracious, but it wasn't where I was at.
No, that's fair enough, yeah. Well, that, Jimmy, brings us to the lightning round.
Yes. Uh-oh.
We're going to play a little game of Would You Rather.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you 5 Would You Rather questions.
Is this going to be like Sammy Hagar or David Lee Roth?
How would you answer that?
Well, I've just dropped myself in it because I don't even know. I'm going to have to say Diamond Dave in the heyday.
Okay, all right.
It's not written in stone, just a thing.
Okay. All right, well, this is all themed about touring, of course. So Here's the scenario. You're on tour. You're on the highway in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
Would you rather be a driver or a passenger?
Well, in the Jimmy the Human days, I was always the driver. In the Screaming Jets days, I'm not the driver. Mm-hmm. So I like being the driver. I'm a bit of a control freak.
Would you rather run out of fuel or get 3 flat tyres?
Run out of fuel any old day.
Would you rather pay $4 per litre for that fuel, or would you rather have to fill up every 100 kilometres?
100 kilometres is not far. I think we'd rather have to pay the big bill.
Ooh, that's going to add up.
100 kilometres, it's not long, not far.
Well, would you rather have no windows? I'm talking about like there were windows there, but there are no windows anymore. Mm-hmm. Or no heating or air conditioning?
No heating or air conditioning. You can rug up.
And finally, would you have the stereo stuck on a foreign language community channel or an early mix of your first album?
Oh, God. It's like welcome to hell. We're going to go with the foreign language station just because we'd probably have some fun in the end listening and joining in with the Latvian fish slap dancing band.
Wonderful. Awesome. Oh, Jimmy, thank you so much for joining me, taking the time out of your busy schedule.
No worries. Nice to be here.
And for everyone listening, if you've enjoyed this, please subscribe and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for listening. Hey, it's your friendly neighborhood podcast host here. Hey, if you like the show, I'd really appreciate it if you could help spread the word. We are all up in the internet, so visit us at www.dorisyoudarlingbus.com, or you can like us on Facebook, or you can follow us on Instagram.
So go ahead, check all of them out, tell all your friends, and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.